What if I told you that there was one simple thing you could do right now to start seeing better results in your Yu-Gi-Oh games? It seems obvious once you know about it, but I've seen time and time again that even the best players can make mistakes when it comes to this concept. Every player, whether you're just starting your competitive journey or already have plenty of competitive experience, could stand to benefit from improving their deck building skills. Now, I've already released a video on this topic a while ago that covers the fundamentals, so I'd highly recommend checking that out first before watching this video, since it builds on the ideas discussed there and uses some terms that I explain as well. Now, with that out of the way, let's hop straight into today's topic. In my first deck building video, I talked a lot about using specific mathematically quote-unquote correct ratios for cards when building your deck, and in today's video I'll be covering 3 additional points: how to make the most of your side deck, how to incorporate the right tech cards into your deck every format, and finally going through some examples of top performing decks that have broken typical deck building rules and explaining why they worked. So if you've ever played at a tournament before, chances are that you've used your side deck. This first section explains how to properly build the side deck and how to build your main deck with side decking in mind. The side deck is arguably the most important part of deck building, since you play at least half of your games with access to it, but it's a very simple concept at its core. At the end of the day, the purpose of a side deck is simple: to improve otherwise poor matchups for your deck, or to provide powerful blowouts against the strongest decks of the format. But how do you know how many cards you should dedicate to each matchup, and how do you know which cards you should side out from your main deck? That's where deck building skills come into play. Let's start by taking a look at the main deck of the Pearly deck list that got 3rd place at YCS Indianapolis in 2023. While I'm not sure what exactly this player chose to side out every time, most of the time you'll only want to side out cards that don't make up a part of your deck's main engine, since you'll want to maintain the consistency of your deck. In this decklist case, that would mean you'd only side out the hand traps like Nibiru and Drone Lockbird, since they're cards that don't directly contribute to the deck's engine. Now, one caveat of this is sometimes you'll want to increase the number of non-engine cards in your deck to have a greater chance of seeing them in certain situations. In these cases, it's okay to side out a few of the quote-unquote less important engine cards in your deck. In this deck list, that could be a few copies of Perlily when going second, since you'd expect to not need all 3 copies in your deck, or a few copies of Stray Pearly Street in a matchup when targeting effects aren't prevalent. Keep in mind though that even with the extra card you draw when you're going second, it's still crucial to make sure that all your key engine pieces are still in your deck so that you aren't missing out on any options. Overall, with this deck list, you'd have around 9 to 14 cards you could consistently afford to side out, making it so you'll rarely struggle to find the right cards to take out. Now, taking a closer look at the actual side deck itself, you'll notice that this player chose to go with cards that can generally be used against most decks, as opposed to matchup specific cards. Although I normally recommend including cards that specifically help to beat a popular matchup, in the context of this event, this was likely just a decision to cover the most matchups as possible, since it was the start of a new format. That being said, there are still some important things we can take away from the side deck. Although these cards cover a lot of matchups, cards like Summon Limit and Dark Ruler No More are cards that can single-handedly win some games, making it so you don't need to play as many cards that fulfill similar rules or cover the same matchups. For example, this player could side in Dark Ruler No More against heavy combo decks, and consider taking out less impactful cards in that matchup, like potentially Engine, that wouldn't be able to help them stop your opponent from going off. This is one of the key ideas behind building an effective side deck. The higher impact the cards are that you side, the less of them you'll need to play, leaving you with more room for cards that can cover other matchups. As a quick side note, there are exceptions to this rule of course, and in certain cases it can be beneficial to play more cards that fulfill the same role just because you want to increase your chances of seeing it, since it's just that important. So to summarize this section, first you'll want to identify which cards you can side out in every game, then you'll want to make sure that you build your side deck in a way that has a good balance of cards that cover a variety of different matchups, and as a final tip, having a plan for what to side in and out for each specific meta matchup will absolutely help you succeed over the course of a long tournament. Now, if you played any amount of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh ever, then you'll know that most, if not all decks, will have some extra slots where they can play stable cards that aren't a part of their core engine. I'll refer to these cards as tech cards for the sake of consistency in this section. One of the most important decisions you'll make when deck building is what to put in these slots after you finish adding in the cards that comprise your deck's main engine. Now let's take a look at the same Pearly list from the previous section. You'll notice that the tech cards take up 15 of the 40 slots in the main deck, which is on the higher end of the average amount you'll see in the most modern decks. Sometimes it might even be worth cutting down on your deck's core engine in order to make more space for tech cards. For example, this player only played 2 straight Pearly Street when it was fairly standard to play 3, allowing him to play 1 extra tech card that might make the difference in the long run. Now, you'll see that this player decided to go with mostly hand traps as their tech card of choice, and deciding on what types of tech cards to play is usually the biggest choice you'll have to make when deck building. Will you play hand traps like Ash Blossom, board breakers like Forbidden Droplets, a mix of both, or forgo them altogether and rely on your engine to fulfill the role of these tech cards? Factors that affect this range from the state of a metagame to potential synergies or anti-synergies with your deck. Now, once again, using the Pearly list from Indianapolis as an example, we can see that hand traps were the tech cards of choice. Since this event was right at the start of a new format and there was a lot of uncertainty as to what the most popular decks would be, playing hand traps like Ash Impermanence to cover all matchups and Droll and Nibiru for more unexpected matchups like Manadium for example make more sense. In addition, since the Pearly deck draws a lot of cards through Sleepy Memory on the opponent's turn, hand traps have additional synergy with the deck since they can be used on the turn they're drawn, as opposed to board breakers that would just sit idly in the hand and actually have anti-synergy with the deck's main engine. Now, a combination of these factors is likely what motivated this player to choose to fill his tech slots in this deck with hand traps. So to summarize this section, when choosing the right tech cards to play in your deck, you'll want to consider factors like the other decks in the metagame and how these tech cards might synergize with your deck's core engine. Now in this final section, we're going to be taking a look at some of the decks that have done well at big events yet have broken some rules of standard deck building. I'll start off with Steven Santoli's first place YCS Indianapolis Rescue Ace deck. The two main things I want to point out about this deck is the main deck count and the choices for certain ratios of cards. Conventional deck building advice you'll hear is to keep your main deck count at 40 in order to be the most consistent as possible. Let's look at the starter cards he played for example. 3 Airlifter, 1 Reinforcement of the Army, the 5-die Bellstar cards, 3 Emergency, and 2 Prosperities, which make for a total of 14. If you remember what I mentioned in my earlier deck building video, 11 to 13 starters was the recommended amount to shoot for when deck building with 40 cards in mind. In Santoli's deck, he probably could have played a clean 40 by cutting 2 of these cards, but by playing 42 and increasing his starter count by 2, he actually saw around a 3% increase in consistency at the cost of marginal decreases in the probabilities of seeing other non-starter cards in his deck. The point I want to make here is while playing 40 cards generally does ensure that your deck is as consistent as possible, if you do go over 40 cards, increasing the number of cards that fulfill a certain role, like starters in this case, will ensure that your deck retains similar probabilities of seeing cards of a certain role and maintain its consistency. And while these differing percentages in deck building may seem small and insignificant, they're exactly what can give players an edge throughout a longer tournament and add some certainty to an otherwise somewhat luck-based game. And it's definitely an advantage that you'll want to have. The next point I want to make is about his ratios. Let's specifically focus on the 2 Pot of Prosperities. In general, you want to play as many copies of unsearchable cards as you can in order to see them as consistently as possible. And with a card as powerful as Pot of Prosperity, one might wonder why he chose to play 2 as opposed to 3. In his deck profile, he mentioned that he never wanted to see 2 copies of Prosperity at once and would rather see 0 copies instead since it wasn't a crucial engine piece. Once again, the actual difference in probability of seeing a certain card doesn't go up by that much if you increase it by 1, and he makes a fair point, since drawing 2 Pot of Prosperities, however low that probability may be, can be more detrimental than not seeing it at all. So at the end of the day, unless a card is absolutely crucial to your deck, like Airlifter for example in this deck, it's okay to play less than 3 copies of a card if you're just using it to bump up the ratios of cards that fulfill a certain role. And for the last deck list I want to take a look at, we'll use Steven Trifanowski's 4th place Manadium deck list from YCS Indianapolis. In particular, I wanted to take a closer look at his side deck since it embodies some of the points that I mentioned earlier in the side decking section of this video. I mentioned earlier that it's important to have specific cards that cover problematic or popular matchups, and we see that Underworld Goddess of the Close World and Herald of the Abyss can fulfill this role against Pearly, which was projected to be one of the most popular decks of the new format. I also wanted to draw attention to Triple Tactics Thrust in particular that has the flexibility to fulfill multiple roles. For example, getting access to specific blowouts like Evenly Matched, or turn 1 bomb cards like Dimensional Barrier. Although few and far between, cards like Thrust that can fulfill multiple roles are particularly strong since they allow you to cover an even wider number of matchups with all the side deck slots you open up. They also make it sensible to break traditional deck building rules of trying to maximize the number of copies of cards you want to see, since Thrust can effectively act as 3 more copies of any normal spell or trap card. So overall, even though Steven's side deck didn't have many 3-0s, the fact that he played a card like Thrust meant he could still cover a wide variety of situations like a set deck should be able to, which I have no doubt contributed to his overall success. And with that, I'm going to conclude the points here. If you found it helpful, you may also find it useful to check out the first video I made on deck building that I mentioned earlier once again. Even if you have plenty of the competitive experience, deck building is a fundamental skill that you'll need to use every time you enter a tournament, and I have no doubt that by improving these skills, you'll be able to start seeing better results. Now, if you're also interested in getting your very own custom playmats, tabletop mats, or card sleeves, then please check out your playmat using my affiliate link for 10% off your entire order, while also helping to support me in the description below. Also be sure to check out CardTrader Zero using my link in the description below to get a welcome bonus, while also having any purchase help support me as well. With all that being said, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.